Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Senator, I want to start critical minerals, start with the big picture. Obviously, we're in the midst of global competition around minerals. China is increasingly dominant with processing. For anyone who doesn't know, you are an expert and a leader on this topic. You've been very active in the Senate. You also, I believe, are the only geologist in the Senate.
They tell me I'm the only scientist in the Senate, someone who's actually written peer-reviewed articles for journals. That's irrelevant.
Right. Well, so just maybe to give a really big picture overview, what is your sense of the U.S. position? How do you assess the landscape, the strategic landscape for the U.S. on critical minerals at this moment?
Well, it's a mixed bag. It's challenging, and we have a divided Congress, in many cases a divided country, at a time when we need to unify as quickly as possible. And I think strategic minerals is an excellent place where that unity can be found, because it is bipartisan. It's universal, and it allows that unique opportunity to look at historically divided initiatives. So you have the environmental community on one side, you have the mining industry on another, often at loggerheads, and yet now they have an alignment of self-interest, which is in business or in government where good things happen. And you're not going to be able to address climate change without really ramping up the amount of critical minerals we have access to and how we process them, and make sure we have supply chains that are clean and safe. And at the same time, if the environmental community is serious about climate, therefore they will also look at, all right, we need to mine and process these critical minerals, and by setting up real regulations and laws in the United States, we set the stage for the rest of the country, the rest of the world. What standards we establish in the United States often are, transported, sometimes diluted, but largely set the stage for regulations and laws in other countries.
So as I mentioned, you've introduced a lot of various legislation on this. I mean, what does the pathway more concretely look like to you to get a bipartisan consensus on supporting critical minerals?
So the thing I keep coming back to, and I talk about this as an opportunity to help unify the country, we need a business plan. We need some sort of a document or a number of different documents. And I think this is part of why SAFE and a 3-day effort like this it's why it's so critical, because without a plan, we're always going to run into one obstacle after another. And once you set a plan successfully and you get the right people involved in creating that plan so that there's a broad sense of ownership, then you can actually begin moving at speed. And we're so far behind in this right now. I mean, China is way out ahead of us. We really need to have sort of a Sputnik moment of, if you remember back, actually many people are too young to remember back to when the Russians began putting satellites in space and we weren't even ready. And suddenly, within 5 years, we were able to get almost 2 million Americans at work creating a space effort that was, again, almost a wartime initiative in terms of the sense of urgency that they had. And I think we need that effort now with critical minerals. We need to bring people together and really emphasize that everything, the actual where the minerals are, how they're extracted, the processing, are you going to be able to use byproducts or tailings as recycling and get part of that mix in there? What's our workforce look like? And again, the Chinese are far ahead of us. I think we're at 650 is what the number I was told of a couple months ago of mining students and mining-related students in the United States, whereas, in China you've got over 12,000. And that, where you have workforce is kind of setting the stage for where you're going to be successful. So all this could be, if we had a business plan, if we had actually took the time and pushed forward on this, we would be able to move. We could move much more quickly. We could accelerate our processes. We could have a much greater sense of urgency. It's one of the reasons I think Chris Wright, as the Secretary of Energy, is one of those people. I mean, he's so knowledgeable, and he and I agree about we disagree on I have a much greater sense of urgency around climate than he does, but we look at the landscape in a similar way, and I think he has the potential to be a unifying person that could help us get towards a business plan. And once we do in this country, it becomes almost instantly global.
So you see this business plan idea as something coming out of the Department of Energy? Is that?
Well, that's one. It could come out of SAFE. I mean, I'm agnostic in terms of who owns it or where it comes from, but certainly the Department of Energy is a great place, just because you've got someone like Chris Wright who has a deep knowledge on not just oil and gas and not just geothermal or solar or wind or nuclear. I mean, he is deep. He goes pretty deep in every energy field, but he also understands critical minerals. So he's the likely place, given the setting of the landscape now, he's the likely place where this could come from.
So you mentioned international partners, and of course that's necessary to develop these supply chains. And I'm just curious how you see the landscape for that now, given the maybe changing sort of geopolitical conversations. Just to put it, diplomatically, I guess. How do you see forming those sort of relationships in this context? Where do you see opportunities? Where do you see challenges? And how do we overcome them?
Well, the dominance of China has helped unify us in a serious sense. And when they decided they weren't going to export, gallium and antimony, some of these critical minerals, it really put a laser-like focus on our deficiencies and created within Congress, which is a remarkable concept to conceive, but a sense of urgency that we needed to bring a bunch of these different bills together and move forward. And I think the president's, when he put forward his executive order around critical minerals, that's, I think, important. It demonstrates that there's a drive within the administration to get this done. But that's not enough. We need bipartisan laws to set this process really going forward so that it can move quickly instead of stops and starts and stops and starts.
Well, maybe let's change gears a little bit and just talk a bit about permitting reform. Maybe just to start, obviously, I think I take it for granted that everyone here will have a sense of why permitting reform is important, but maybe you could give us your sense of why this matters. You've been active in those discussions in the last Congress and presumably will be going forward. So maybe just give us your sense of why this is such an important issue, then we'll get into where things stand.
Sure. And again, this is at the alignment of self-interest, where you have environmental community, or large parts of the environmental community have for years tried to slow down development because they saw many of the major developments happening around the world as threats to the quality of our environment and the degradations that could come to that, or the depreciation of that quality from large projects. So they looked at every possible way they could slow those things down. Now, when you look at the specter of climate change, and I have a great sense of urgency around climate change. I'm one of those people that believes it could accelerate. The feedback loops are potentially so dramatic that the damage could be much worse than what we actually see. And that sense means that we've got to, we can no longer spend 15 or 20 years on a permitting process, because it's not just for this mine or that mine. And again, I'm the first person. If we're going to have a mine anywhere in the world, we should have standards set by which we can extract those minerals safely and fairly in terms of how workers are treated, and make sure that there's a plan in place so that the remediation, when the mining is done, that landscape can be returned to a place that the local community will accept. I understand all that. But we can have that without having to spend 20 years, and 20 years for each permit now. And we're talking about transmission lines. If you want to get wind or solar or electricity from one place to another, we're going to need some significant additions to our transmission system, our grid. And again, we don't have the luxury of time to go through 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps to the side. We need to be much more direct in how we do this. And it is to everyone's benefit. It allows us to address climate change much more rapidly. It allows utilities to be able to grow and be more successful more rapidly, and the same with mining companies. It's an opportunity here, and again, there's long histories. It's a little bit like the Hatfields and the McCoys. If you might be a little too young, Justin, for that analogy, but where you have generations of animosity, we now have to kind of rebuild those relationships in a way that recognizes that we have an alignment of self-interest. There is a goal there that is serving the interests of both parties.
Well, I'm hearing that theme, alignment of self-interests, over and over again. So let's make it more concrete. So at the end of last Congress, there was a push for a bipartisan consensus. Ultimately, didn't make it over the finish line. Maybe first off, what happened, and then what are the conversations that are ongoing now at Energy and Natural Resources and across across the Senate? What are you hoping for?
So I'll start with the last question first. I'm hoping to win. And when I say win, I want to find an outcome. I want to get enough people believing in an outcome that we can do a bunch of these, get a bunch of these laws that a lot of them are written and have been put forward, get them passed, and have that be part of a package that really allows us to imagine a solution to all the things that we're talking about. And I think, why it didn't get across the finish line last session. I spent 20 years in the restaurant business, in the bar business. So I spent a lot of time around very diverse groups of people arguing about things, often just for the sake of arguing. That's a lot of what happens after about 11 o'clock. If you've got a restaurant that has a lively bar environment, you hear a lot of these arguments. That's some of the arguments we heard at the end of the permitting process. I'm making that as a joke, so I hope I'm not offending any representatives or senators who might be listening in. I'll get myself in trouble. But I don't think it failed on the merits of what we were trying to do. I think it failed because I think some staff got crosswise with each other, to be blunt.
Right.
And I think that I know we're going to revisit that. I know it's going to be hard work. Again, you're asking communities that have resisted these types of solutions for a long time to accept compromises that don't come naturally. And yet, in our form of government, without those compromises, we're not going to get the progress that I think everyone agrees that we need.
Just to zoom in on that point, because you mentioned the environmental groups, and of course environmental groups have been opposed, some environmental groups have been opposed. This is a community that you engage with. I mean, what is the case that you make? Is that a roadblock that you need to overcome, or is that just sort of not irrelevant, but is it not a sufficient roadblock to stop this from happening?
Well, I think it is essential. I mean, I don't think the environmental community in this country has such a tradition and such a level of influence on decision makers at every level. I'm not talking about just in the Capitol here in Washington. I'm talking about in state houses across the country. I'm talking about in municipal offices. We need the environmental community to recognize that if we're going to really address climate change, we've got to figure out how to go forward on these issues. We need a whole bunch more copper and nickel, not to mention all the rare earths or all the other critical minerals. We're going to need them rapidly. If we want more electric vehicles, clean electrical generation of whether you're talking about wind or solar, all of these transitions to a cleaner, reliable, inexpensive energy future, all of these are going to rely on addressing some of these issues around critical minerals. And the willingness, and I want to emphasize that I've had mostly, almost universally, positive response from environmental communities. Not that they're saying, we're okay with this or we're okay with that, but they're open to looking at this and recognizing that there is an imperative here, that we are going to need critical minerals, and we all have a responsibility to make sure that they are extracted and processed in a place that doesn't compromise our environment, doesn't compromise our sense of how workers should be treated, that we can set certain standards in this country that, again, if they might be changed or watered down or diluted in some way in other parts of the world, but they are at least creating a framework that functions as a starting point, whether it's in Africa or in, East Asia, or wherever.
So one of the things, I mean, you keep bringing up bipartisan alignment in the context of shared incentives, and I wanted to ask about China, which of course has come up already this morning quite a bit, and will come up throughout the course of this summit. And I'm curious, if China is a bipartisan unifier that can get folks on the same page when we're talking about these issues, namely competition with China, particularly around some of these things that maybe have been more difficult, thinking about climate-related things especially. So do you see that as an avenue for coming up with that bipartisan alignment that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that you have to have an enemy. There has to be an ogre in the room to bring people together. It's like the old adage that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. A national rival at a very high level is a terrible thing to waste. And it has proven to be a very useful tool to get Republicans and Democrats to sit down together and say, yeah, we all agree that China is out ahead of us, that they have already established not just controlling the access to the minerals in terms of extraction, but processing. They are so far ahead of us in terms of processing that we just got a lot of work to do to make sure that we can create supply chains that we can depend upon. And again, Republicans, Democrats, I don't see how anyone can argue with that. And in the same way that the mining community and the environmental community have to accept some of these basic realities as they look at what is the compromise here and how do we get to that point? And how do we get to that point more rapidly?
I like that. National rival is a terrible thing to waste. That's a good line. I want to go back to this point. I sort of asked you about it already, but I do want to underscore it. It's been a theme in your legislation, and it is important in the context of China, and that is international partnerships. And so I do want to come back to that and just ask you again. What is the role for these global partnerships with international partners, and then how does the U.S. make the case to these partners that the U.S. is a good place to do business on these things? And I'll just add this sort of note of, I talked to the Canadian Energy and Natural Resources Minister a few weeks ago, who was very angry. But he also, said we still want to do partnership on critical minerals. So I'd just be curious to your reflections on how we can take advantage of some of those partnerships, even in the context of everything else.
Yeah, I would not approach it the same way that President Trump is approaching it, but that's not to say that he won't be successful. There are a lot of different ways to skin a cat, and Canada is a great example. I mean, they are good at extraction and processed minerals. Maybe not the best in class, but they are really good. A lot of our alliances, Australia, in many ways, if you go to mining projects around the world, you will often find the senior engineer, the senior management, all got their original training in Australia. Australia really, for a long time, dominated, in terms of their higher education, mining industry professionals. A lot of that's been ceded now to China. And certainly if you're in Africa and you go to mines there, you're likely to find Chinese-trained, or at least the younger professionals are often from China. So our allies, however we negotiate with them, are going to be essential. We don't have the resources, the critical minerals, in sufficient quality and where it can be accessed profitably and efficiently. We don't have those types of deposits in the United States. And I did my first class in industrial minerals back when I was a geologist or geology student, And on the Maslow hierarchy of science, I'm not sure that there is a Maslow hierarchy of science, but geology would be down towards the bottom, I think, because there's not as much mathematics involved. It's how we used to joke about it in the labs. But looking at that class was back in 1976, I think, or industrial minerals. And even back then, we could recognize that long-term, there were a lot of needs that we could not fill just from what minerals we had in the United States, with assays of sufficient quality that they could justify large-scale extraction. That means that we've got, whether we're talking to countries in East Asia or Africa, I mean, we're so far behind in Africa right now, the penetration of that market by the Chinese is, I mean, it's not irreversible, but again, we're starting way behind. We're in better shape in South America, but China's there all at the same time pushing and offering contracts and making investments into their governments at a level that we're just not. And whether you're talking about any of these places in the world where we have historically good alliances and good relationships, we need to maintain those relationships in a constructive way so that all those decisions that have to be made properly before we can get to a mine opening or processing centers developed, there are many, many decisions that happen from the local level all the way up to the senior government officials at the national level. We've got to do a better job of getting all those decisions resulting in favorable access for U.S. interests.
Well, I want to ask about climate, and just 6 months ago, the climate change would have been brought up explicitly. CO2 emissions would have been brought up explicitly, I think, more often throughout the course of the days you've brought it up. But I guess I'm curious how you see climate fitting into this conversation today, as opposed to how it might have fit in 6 months ago. Is that a problem, or how do you approach it in conversations, particularly these bipartisan conversations that are so critical to actually getting things done today?
Yeah, this is another one back when I was a grad student in the late 70s, in what geology we all called it, but back then they were renaming the department the Earth and Environmental Science Department. Back then we called it the greenhouse effect. We didn't even call it climate change. Most of the top scientists I know who have spent real time in this, and they're not dependent on research dollars, they don't have other incentives to over-dramatize the threat that we see from the rapidly changing climate. Most of them feel that we should have a much, much higher sense of urgency, and that there are feedback loops such as deep oceanic, levels of carbon that are held in the deeper parts of the ocean that could be freed up under certain conditions, the permafrost. I mean, there's a pretty long list of bad things that could happen. I think that the divisions that we've had over climate change and people saying it's a fraud or a hoax and other people saying the end of the world is near, the right response at this moment in time is to say, hey, everyone's got to recognize that this is a real possibility, and we can evaluate it and try. If we get to a business plan, we can try and put some guardrails on how we look at it and how we assess the probability that this horrible or that horrible is really going to happen or not happen. And I think we should follow where the facts take us. And I'm, as a scientist, I'm not. I recognize that science isn't perfect, and we should always be reevaluating and trying to get it better and get it right. When I first started studying geology, no one believed in continental drift. And right in the decade before I started studying, a number of different facts came to the surface that suddenly transformed the global geological opinion that not only was continental drift not some extreme fantasy, but it was real, and it was happening, and it helped explain why we have volcanoes where they are, what mid-ocean spreading ridges look like, and why all these phenomena that we had observed but could not explain, it all came together. And I think we're at that point where many of us feel that climate change has that level of facts supporting it, and that we have to be having a greater sense of urgency to it. But there's a group there that are adamantly opposed to that and pushing back. So we have to continue to reevaluate. That's the job of science. But as we reevaluate, we've got to keep the forward momentum and be looking at what are the greatest things to worry about, and how do we make sure that we're addressing them in the most cost-effective way and making our investments so that we cover both probabilities. There are some Scottish geologists back in the late 19th century that created a theory of multiple working hypotheses. So you've got a hypothesis for one solution to a problem and a different hypothesis for a different solution to the same problem. As you collect information and invest yourself in possible solutions, you don't want to rule out any of your 2 or 3 or 4 hypotheses. You want to keep all the multiple hypotheses in process. You want to be working on all of them until you get sufficient so that you feel secure going in one direction and focusing on that one direction. I think we've kind of got to pull back a little bit and resort to doing several things at once while we have this much pushback around climate change. But again, most of the people I most respect in science continue to feel that this is a dire threat and that we are losing, by not having a greater sense of urgency, we are losing precious time.
Well, I'm going to try to do this as gracefully as possible. I was told there would be a countdown clock, and I don't actually see one. So to the organizers, if I need to stop, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll keep asking questions all day. But please, somebody flag me if and when I need to stop. And apologies for that. So just to shift gears a little bit, I mean, so innovation is obviously critically important. There's a lot of possibility for innovation in mining techniques, which might be able to allow us to produce more environmentally friendly and sort of resolve some of the issues that have been roadblocks to mining here in the US. There are companies that are raising private capital to do that. What's the role of government in advancing these innovations?
So Tom Tillis, who's a Republican senator from North Carolina, have a bill together called, I always get these wrong, I hate it's the Unearth Innovation Act, if someone can shout out if I've misphrased it. But innovation is one of the things that our higher education system has helped make the United States the global leader in innovation for a long time. And this goes back many decades. I mean, back at least as far as World War II, and you could argue even before that. And our innovation, I mean, a good example, and this was talking to Chris Wright several months ago, he wrote algorithms and helped create the approach to fracking that allowed natural gas to be extracted successfully from what used to be called tight shales. That same approach to fracking and those algorithms, he later, 20 years later, was asked would they work for helping fracture rock at great depth for geothermal energy generation. And of course, it turns out that what you're trying to do is different, and yet the same approach to fracking carries out. And so that's a classic case of innovation in one place leads to innovation in the next. No one would have thought that getting into tight shales would eventually be part of the solution to harvesting geothermal energy at scale. And it's one of those things that we haven't recognized, I don't think sufficiently, the potential that this large-scale geothermal could have in terms of energy or electrical generation. Anyway, those innovations are happening all the time in every process in this country, especially where we integrate the industrial needs and processes with our higher education, our research universities. And our research at those universities everyone thinks that our priority is only on medical science, or maybe too much placed on that. I mean, we need that research, but we also need to make sure that in terms of quantum computing, artificial intelligence, all these other factors, we need that research at the highest level. And all of that research is going to allow us, when integrated into mining, extraction, and processing, that's how we're going to keep getting the levels of innovation. And again, that's why getting a business plan so we can see exactly what innovations are happening where and how they're changing our assessments of what we need most and what our priority next year should be. It's all going to come down to understanding much more clearly how fast our present is changing and where those innovations are taking place. But we're not going to catch up with China without some massive innovation. We're going to have to out-innovate them, which I think we can do. I'm very optimistic about that.
Well, thank you. That's a great note to end on. I think three things that stood out to me. One is this consistent emphasis on planning and coordination, which you've called a business plan. Also the possibilities of bipartisan collaboration and finding areas for alignment, China as one of those. And then that last note about innovation. Thank you so much, Senator Hickenlooper.
No, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.